I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined by Nick Eftimiades, an American government official, author, and educator, best known for his work Chinese Intelligence Operations, written in 1994. Nick retired after a 34-year government career, including employment in the CIA as a technical operations officer, a special agent in the U.S. Department of State, the Bureau of Diplomatic Security, and as a senior intelligence officer in the Defense Intelligence Agency. Nick was also a senior research fellow at King's College War Studies Department. He has an MS in Strategic Intelligence from the National Defense Intelligence College, a BA in East Asian Studies from George Washington University. He currently works as an assistant teaching professor in the Penn State Homeland Security Program. His views are his own and do not represent Penn State. So Nick, welcome, sir. You are the author of Chinese Intelligence Operations, which you published back in '94, and you're a recognized subject matter expert on the topic of Chinese espionage. So thank you for joining me. Thank you very much for your service. And can you tell me a little bit about your background and what has made this a long-term focus area for you?
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, I published my first work on this in 1994. I have since published monographs and papers and things of that nature. In fact, I have another one coming out this coming summer on that subject. I did part of my undergraduate and graduate research in Taiwan and mainland China. Got my initial degree in East Asian Studies. So I have been a lifelong China hand. And it just so happens I fell into writing on Chinese espionage. At that time that I first started, and this is back in the '89, Tiananmen had just happened, the Tiananmen incident. And there were a lot of people who basically defected and said, I had been spying for China, and, I'm so sorry I did that now. And a professor at that time said, why don't you write on this? So I did, and that was the start of it all.
Okay. Well, let me jump into China's overall strategy, because I think that's we could kind of take this top-down approach here. From what I understand, the basic why is about more than simply economic competition. This is part of the PRC leadership's dream, right? Can you tell me a little bit about the motivations at play here and how they affect things?
Sure. So this is something that Xi Jinping has said numerous occasions. It's been in the Chinese press for the last 10 years, and it is the China dream. From Xi's perspective, and from the perspective of the Chinese Communist Party, and even in younger Chinese who are quite nationalistic at this point, the story has been that they've been abused for a century, and in fact they call that. They literally say that. They say at the hands of the West, they have suffered a century of humiliation. And this ran from the Opium Wars in the 1840s all the way up to the time when Mao stood at Tiananmen Square in 1949 and said, the Chinese people have finally stood up. So, from their perspective, they've been abused by the West for a century. They have suffered a century of humiliation. So their goal and their intent is to take their rightful place, and I'm quoting him, to take their rightful place at the top of the world by 2049, 100 years after the birth of modern China.
Okay. So this is more than this is more than just, again, more than an economic competition. This is national dream.
One economic competition is one element of it. Foreign policy, global influence is another element of it. Innovation, drive, and change, and modernization of Chinese society is another element of it. So changing the global world order, and China has said this, has said quite publicly, and actually said to the current president, and said, democracy is at its end. It can't compete in the next era in being able to make decisions for a population. It's got to be a Chinese democracy. So from their perspective, they are heading towards ruling the world, being at the center of the world, as the name China, Zhongguo, is center of the earth, Middle Kingdom as they call it. So from their perspective, they are headed to the top, and all that we see around us occurring, whether it's military growth and development, whether it's economic competition, whether it's political influence globally, along with corruption and coercion, all these are elements of China's hybrid warfare style to move to the center of, to move to the top of the world.
Okay. Well, now, before we go further, I want to delineate, especially for the audience, between state level interests and the Chinese people. How do we effectively address the problem of Chinese espionage while avoiding discrimination based on the cultural and ethnic heritage or immigration status of Chinese people?
Yeah, we've had a long history of doing this. We had a whole half a century of Russian espionage, a Cold War that we dealt with. We weren't yelling and screaming about that. We had, Cuba. We weren't yelling and screaming about that, about it being, anything more than what it was, a nationalistic model, a nationalistic political and military model that threatened our security. And that's the way I think we need to keep it. It's unfortunate, but if you take a look at how the FBI conducts these investigations, they really have absolutely nothing to do with race. I mean, and it's very easy to list for you the steps that is done, and you can see how it has absolutely nothing to do with race. But, typically our academics don't know this. The Chinese like to fan the flames of racism as much as they can. So I think the government gets a very bad rap. It's the initial quote of, oh, it's happening, it must be racist.
Yeah, yeah. Well, now you mentioned the FBI investigations. So one of the reasons that I'm really excited to do this interview is you maintain a database of Chinese espionage incidences, and you are closing in on 700 cases, and many of these are recent. It seems like there's a massive uptick in this. So
Yes.
I guess I'm wondering, how many more do you think go unreported? And are there any estimates about the financial and strategic cost of these losses?
Um, that's interesting because I tried doing estimates on the financial losses, and it's extraordinarily. The answer to your question first is no on the financial side, and the reason is because so much of this espionage is targeted against industry, and not just in U.S. industry but globally. And so, how do you account for market share when China is actively working on stealing a vaccine, for example? Technology, and they're going to produce it and sell it globally. Well, I mean, first off, that company that has been the victim has to be willing to talk, and most often they're not, because it affects their share prices immediately. If they've lost, quote, the crown jewels. But I've talked to company after company with each having suffered hundreds of millions of dollars in loss, just having key technology stolen. So, if you were to rough estimate this, you could probably put it in the 300 to 400 billion annually in these types of losses. But sometimes one case is over $500 million just
Wow.
in economic gain that we won't be getting because now the Chinese company has stolen it and is now moving forward in the field.
Yeah, and you'd mentioned this is hybrid warfare. So this is economic, social, military, strategic, and so there are
Right.
also strategic losses as well in terms of military technology and presumably, tactical. I mean, what we're
Sure.
doing and
Well, I
stuff
mean,
like that.
the J-20 stealth technology and such are all things that China has stolen. I mean, that you can actually document, and you can see just a host of military technologies that China has stolen over the last 20 years. And from their perspective, you can understand that because they don't want to invest 30 years into research and development. They just want to steal it and move on from there.
Yeah,
So, I mean, that's the way they do it. So their espionage is actually, it's, as I like to call it, it's a whole of society approach. Their laws frame it as such so that people don't have an option if the Chinese government wants their cooperation for theft of foreign information, whether or your diplomatic secrets. You don't have an option in China. I mean, that's stated clearly in Chinese law. So it really does bring forth a whole of society approach. And they also have the infrastructure developed within that society to be able to enforce and promulgate that type of collection.
okay. Well, I want to touch on our commercial supply chain also. We rely so heavily on China for our commercial supply chain. A lot of those products are based on proprietary technology that are designed here in the United States, and they're manufactured on the Chinese mainland. So I guess the other thing I'm wondering is if we have 700 documented cases here of espionage in the United States, how compromised do you think our supply chain is in mainland China where our products are actually made?
Okay, just for a little clarification, those 700 cases are globally. So it's not just in the US, even though
Okay.
predominantly it is in the US. So that's a good question. You know, when I do talk to companies, and I talk to a lot of them on this, the Fortune 50, and it's interesting that you can follow a cycle of a company's work in China from the time they start and look to partnerships and look towards cooperative, and then ultimately wind up losing their intellectual property, losing their trade secrets, losing their customer markets as the Chinese partner takes it over and edges out the U.S. company. There are a couple of rare exceptions to this. Disney is one, Apple, right? iPhones, because they're producing a new model every 18 months. So it really doesn't matter what the Chinese do in the terms of stealing intellectual property stuff, because you have a new Apple that's coming out 18 months anyway. So
Okay.
the cycle is, you know, they're always ahead of the cycle. But so there is problematic on how to do business. And it also, you know, we addressed this in Department of Homeland Security. I was on the economic subcommittee for the Homeland Security Advisory Council, and we did a report in November 2020 and specifically addressed the vulnerabilities of the U.S. supply chain in China, and they're significant. So there are changes that the United States has to make. China knows that Congress in particular is looking at these changes and trying to make them, and China is adapting already internally its supply chain so that it is less vulnerable to the United States and in fact can wean itself off the West. And that's, you know, if you look at China's policy speeches for the last 10 years, that's what they've intended to do. Build up the domestic market to the point where they really aren't subject to any threats from the West on any of their supply chain issues. So,
Okay.
and just recently in the last Party Congress, they came out and said that that was a key issue for national security in securing their own supply chain. So, and that's largely due to the U.S. cutting back on microchips. And
Well, no, you'd mentioned, and I should apologize for getting the 700 wrong. You mentioned that that is a global, and so this is not just an American problem. This is something that affects many nations, especially more technologically developed ones, including the European Union. Can you tell me a little bit about the global scope of this problem?
yeah, it is. It's extraordinary, actually. It's really quite a globally reaching enterprise that China has set up. Ironically, they've made it capitalistic in some senses in rewarding, you know, that type of theft amongst party elements, amongst companies, even amongst individuals. So it's a lot of carrot and stick with Chinese diaspora too, which is difficult. I mean, we've had situations in the United States, in California, Washington State, and also in Australia, where, to give you an example, during the Hong Kong riots, the Hong Kong, you know, efforts toward democracy, people were driving around in mock made-up Chinese police cars, and specifically the Ministry of Public Security, the Chengdu, the FIST units, their counterterrorism units, and they were driving around ethnic Chinese neighborhoods in Los Angeles. So, you know, of course, this is done to try and scare the people locally and to say, look, we're still watching you. You know, where, I mean, I don't know if you've seen the cars, but they actually look very much like the Chinese police cars, and they're the specific units that are most threatening. So, and the only reason I bring something like this up is that an extraordinary reach that they have globally, that they would have a coordinated action in multiple cities in the US and in Australia at the same time period. I mean, this is just one of hundreds of cases that we see in China controlling the ethnic Chinese population abroad, or attempting to, controlling political apparatuses in nations globally, controlling the global business, and all this feeds on a very, very aggressive espionage campaign. So it really is global, and like nothing we've seen in our time.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, that's really troubling. I hadn't heard about that. So there was actual threats and intimidation, it sounds like, against ethnic Chinese populations here in the United States.
You know, and as recently as 2 weeks ago, we had arrests in New York on it, and then a year before, arrests in New York on it. So and they've had, and everywhere from Sweden to France in Europe on the same things. So we've seen China's reach going global, and you know, they do the same thing to businesses. Their own businesses are fall in line immediately, as they must, but even foreign businesses at all doing business with China. I have been in the office, I've been in the room when businesses, US businesses, talk to a member of Congress and say, look, I'm just going to tell you this because this is what the Chinese are telling me to say. Okay, Congressman, this is what they want. You know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's interesting that they will pressure a US business to go back to Congress to make a point for them.
Mm.
So they have extraordinary reach globally like that in just thousands of different venues. It's really amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, now during the last presidential administration, I'd read a lot about this idea of decoupling from China, and I think you touched on that a moment ago, which would involve shifting our Asia-Pacific supply chain reliance to other nations. In fact, I think last time we talked, you had talked about the five tigers, if I remember right. Is decoupling underway, and is this producing any results?
So there's more discussion about it than it actually happening. It's going to require a little policy carrot and stick approach from the United States. There is still, you know, our situation with China is largely due to US ignorance, arrogance, and greed. And those three. The ignorance of our politicians, the arrogance in just believing that inside every Chinese person is a freedom-loving American dying to get out. I mean, that's you know, our perspective. And then the greed of businesses and the political apparatus. As the situation's got more tense, and the Chinese Chinese government has taken actions that have limited businesses, and as labor rates have risen, a number of other things have happened inside China. It's been driving a lot of businesses out. When Trump lowered the tax rate, you know, for bringing money back home, there was a great incentive to bring money back home. So the question is, how does the policy apparatus encourage money coming back home and jobs coming back home? And if it's not going to, and in a lot of cases, that's not going to happen simply because, you know, they're labor jobs, which are either going to be robotic now or just not cost efficient for people in the United States to produce. I mean, we already have a 3% unemployment rate. What's the likelihood we'll be getting people in a lot of manual labor jobs? Probably not very good. I've been a big advocate of creating a Central American Development Fund, moving some of those labor-intensive jobs to Central America, theoretically creating tens of thousands of jobs, and that would probably ease off on our border situation a lot. In fact, it would encourage people not to come to the U.S. when they can get a reasonably good paying job locally. You know, people don't come just because they want the weather, you know, a little cooler weather or something. They're coming because they can't get jobs in their countries. So let's stop taking the most industrious workers, you know, into the United States and ease our supply chain, bring it closer to home, more politically stable, less hostile environments, and at the same time help our border situation.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then there would be tremendous savings on like the transportation costs and all that for these products.
Right.
Well, so let me touch on some of the strategies and tactics that are used. You've talked about a combination of covert influence and outright theft. Can you give me a rundown on how secrets are commonly stolen?
Well, one of the great reasons, Tim, for things you learn from a database like this is that it depends. It depends on the technology or the secrets in the case of national security secrets, where some people will think, oh, it's all the same. No, it really isn't. You can take a look at, for example, I have about 120 or so cases of theft of aerospace technology. Now, that tends to be export violation more than insider threat. A lot of those are cash deals. A lot of those are false documentations, rerouting freight to different countries. So there's a band of techniques that fits in that type of theft, and a profile of behavior that you find on the part of the individuals engaging in that. Front companies and wiring money and things like that, turning down training agreements and maintenance agreements, things like that. All that because they know they're moving the technology illegally. That differs dramatically from the 60 or so cases that I have in biotechnology, where the vast threat, the top of the line threat is PhDs, which is not the case in the aerospace industry. It's insider threat. It's people working on that type of technology, people with family relations or business relations inside China, people who are traveling within certain time periods, that type of thing. And you can actually lock this down between age, types of espionage techniques, types of communications, covert and otherwise. So the simple answer, it really depends on what type of technology or what type of secrets are being stolen.
Okay. Well, now back in 2019, you published Chinese Espionage Tradecraft Summary. And it's a really amazing document. I'll put a link to that in the interview. So that had a breakdown of the cases that were in your database at the time. I think it was about 465 back then. So it appears that the majority of these are being done by relatively normal personnel without sophisticated tools and techniques. So I guess, are we dealing with kind of a well-oiled espionage machine, or is this kind of a loose network of independent interests?
Loose network is, well, this is why we call it a whole of society approach, because while we have the loose network and the Chinese government setting up institutions to encourage that type of theft, you also have the Ministry of State Security involved. You have the People's Liberation Army involved. So, there's a variance of tradecraft. In fact, one of the most amazing aspects of this is that there's a variance of tradecraft even within places like the Ministry of State Security. In some cases, Kevin Mallory, for example, they were using a software that they had designed, which was supposed to encrypt and send data and then destroy it. Didn't work, didn't destroy it. But they were using a specially designed software for Kevin. And yet, on the other hand, we've seen them literally making phone calls from the United States to China and sending text messages. And you can see actually over time how the tradecraft is changing. They're getting a lot more, the Ministry of State Security, in the case of Edward Peng recently. First time we've seen them publicly using that in the United States. We've seen some agent to handler meetings, Christine Fang in California in 2015. So we've seen a mix of techniques, but they are clearly still running most of their operations out of China itself. And that's because of fear of globally counterintelligence organizations and putting their own case officers at risk. So, but other than that, you can see a lot of variances in tradecraft, depending whether it's a state or an enterprise, the People's Liberation Army, the United Front Work Department, or the Ministry of State Security running the operation.
Well, and that brings me to the next question. So again, you mentioned the Ministry of State Security, the PLA, as well as state-owned enterprises, and then there are private companies involved in this.
Right.
Does that make it harder to detect and counter theft? And are these various organizations, are they working together, or are they, again, mostly kind of working independently?
Well, again, I'm not sure I have great answers for those. In some cases, you do see them working together. We had a case with Zoom recently. Zoom's director of technical security in China, because he was working with the Ministry of Public Security and the Ministry of State Security to collect information on people in the United States and Hong Kong. Zoom, of course, they didn't deny it. They said that they were working very closely with the FBI and had suspended 9 people for their involvement with that. But the FBI did, in their criminal complaint, publish the emails that went back and forth between the Ministry of Public Security and the Ministry of State Security and Zoom. So, or Zoom officials. So you really do see, it's funny because you see the working together and you also see the disagreements, which are not a heck of a lot different from what we used to see in CIA and FBI. Somebody saying, no, let's arrest everybody and stop it now. And the Ministry of State Security saying, no, 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 leave it go, leave the operation go so we can learn more about it. So you definitely see those. Recent case came up in New York City where we saw 4 MSS officers from 2 different offices. First time I had seen that. 4 MSS officers from 2 different offices working the same asset in the United States, switching off with case officers. So the level of coordination seems to be pretty good. The party does a good job in pulling these things together. And a lot of it has to do with funding. You know, when you're talking funding from state-owned enterprises and they're shopping technologies around inside China, and the Communist Party officials are helping with that. So there's this in place for that, particularly for technology theft.
Well, now a lot of this espionage is, as you've described, is often carried out for financial gain. Within China, you'd mentioned, and I've read this before, the laws are structured to ensure that companies, you know, are working with the government. I'm wondering, is coercion used to threaten overseas family members of people with access to sensitive data? Right.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I was just wondering. Well, so is that something that happens where, you know, maybe the person, I guess, maybe the person stealing data or spying or doing the espionage, maybe they don't want to. Maybe they're being threatened. And is that a mitigating factor in prosecution of these cases?
So that's another good question. It has not yet been a mitigating factor, at least not in the United States. There, you know, you see a lot of the threats coming out, certainly against in coercion against democracy advocates, against religious organizations, against anyone that the party deems one of the 5 poisons, right? Falun Gong, you know, Taiwan independence movement, Tibetans, Uyghurs, and anyone who's an advocate for democracy. So a lot of coercion, threatening relatives literally in home and having the relatives call up crying, the person overseas saying, you know, please stop this. They took your brother to jail, that type of thing. That type of coercion and real violence goes on all the time. In sort of academic circles, let's say scholarly circles and circles on technology, the threat is usually more implied. And I actually had a Chinese contact, a friend, tell me this once. He said, you know, the meaning they don't make clear, but the implication is very clear. You know, it's oh, if you didn't help with this, I think that'd really be a problem. Understanding the subtleties, particularly in the Chinese language, when someone says that, you understand that's a real problem for your family, you know, for a host of living. No one wants to, you know, cross that boundary. So even though to us in English, well, they're saying it's a problem. That doesn't sound like a, you know, a real thing. No, in their terminology, that's a very, very direct threat.
I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying. Yeah. So this does happen, and there are lots of different kind of levers that are being pulled then.
Right.
So in November of 2020, and this is more recent, you were on the Economic Security Subcommittee of the Homeland Security Advisory Council, and that published a report proposing DHS Supply Chain Intelligence Center to help secure this critical supply chain infrastructure. Is that the best solution on a federal level? And how effective do you think that's likely to be?
I think it is a solution. I think it's a good solution. I think it will be it's what we've got to do something. We have critical infrastructure that is incredibly vulnerable. You know, when COVID hit and China literally threatened, because over 90% of the precursor chemicals for our antibiotics come from China, and literally threatened, let America die in a sea of COVID. Right? This is what Chinese state media were saying. So the question you have to ask yourself is, how much of your critical infrastructure, particularly with the Internet of Things and, you know, that type of integration into the internet, how much of that do you want resting on that government, which is what you have? on that
Well,
government.
yeah, well, and that's a concern. You know, I was reading about TMSC, right? Taiwan Semiconductor, and
Right.
and this went to an interview I was doing, you know, on manufacturing, and one of the issues I realized there was, so TMSC is based in Taiwan, but they've outsourced their chips to mainland China, and so even in the case of this adversarial relationship that they have, that supply chain still goes all the way back to mainland China, which makes it vulnerable.
Yeah, it absolutely does. So at some point, look, the US government has a problem. And problem for starters, we don't have a strategy. And I ask this all the time in some of the senior ranks, whether it be Defense Department or the other elements of the US government, say, where do you see the China relationship, China-US relationship in 10 years? What defines success? What are we striving for? What defines success? Nobody knows. Nobody has an answer for that. Oh, it should be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You know, there is no interagency government strategy that says we need to get to A to B, and this is how we're doing it. Okay, ends, ways, and means. That's the way that's the way we create strategies in the government. Ends, ways, and means that are all crafted together to do this. We have nothing that tells us how to execute the strategy for the most critical relationship in all of human history, right? At this point.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
I mean, you know, barring that, we're piecemealing everything. And one of the good piecemeals you could put together to protect at a minimum, at least critical infrastructure, would be a a supply chain intelligence center under Department of Homeland Security.
Okay. Well, now you'd mentioned the pandemic, and I do think that's really interesting because during the pandemic, at that same time, we had what they were describing as wolf warrior diplomacy, which seemed like it offended pretty much every country on the planet. And it seems like since then things have kind of calmed down. Is that a good sign? Is
Um,
China?
it's China changes tactics. It's a changing tactic sign. It's kind of interesting because the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, if you talk to them, they hated being dubbed wolf warriors. They really dislike that. And now every time they do anything, but they were getting promoted based on it. So it was encouraging, you know, that type of aggression inside. Post COVID-19, or as COVID-19 tapers off, China's realized it lost a lot. It can no longer behave that way. So it's going to have to find a new way forward, right in the middle of seeing something in the Ukraine, you know, which has potential implications for them. As America's putting together or has joined a quad in Southeast Asia, South and Southeast Asia. So there are a lot of factors that are weighing in on China on how it will have to conduct its foreign policy in the future. Hasn't backed off the wolf warrior bit completely. And that's in large part because of Chinese culture, you know, the way it views relationships.
Okay.
So, I mean, there's nothing in this Confucian collective society that has our equivalent of equality, right? I do a briefing and talking about this, and I show Mitt Romney the day after he lost a presidential election, and just out of nowhere, someone caught him in a picture of him pumping gas in his car. So, you know, here's a guy the morning after he loses the election, and he's out by himself pumping gas in the car. That's a very American thing, right? Because it doesn't matter who, okay, yeah, but you're not president. Now get there and pump your own gas and move along. So it's a level of equality that we all share. You don't have that in China. So when they look at the conduct of foreign policy or their state-to-state relations, there's two things that come into effect. Individualism takes a side seat always to collective good,
Okay.
right? There is no rights of the individual in their own society. It's all what benefits the state, or, you know, what the leadership says to the state. That's number one. Number two, there's no equality. They don't look at other states as being equal. It's either you're above us or you're below us. And that's just a largely function of the Confucian society that has places for everybody and job descriptions for everybody. You know, a father behaves this way, a teacher behaves that way, that type of thing. So, it's a challenge to conduct policy with them.
Okay. Okay. What are there preventative measures that individual companies here in the United States and abroad can take to avoid becoming victims of at least the corporate espionage aspect of this?
Sure, and some of them get pretty good at it. Some of them are horrific. There no question for insider threat programs and to protect yourself. There are things that companies can do. I coach a lot of them when dealing with China. However, it honestly, Tim, I'm amazed at sometimes at how I'll say ignorant. It sounds negative, but how just unaware or unknowing a lot of C-suite officials are. It's mind-boggling. I had one company that lost, they believe they lost, still quite not sure, 400 million in research efforts and the technology they had developed. 400 million. And then they turned around and afterwards asked me, or would they still be after it now? Is it done now? I said, well, I'm sorry, what do you mean? And they said, do we still have to protect this to, given that we 50-50, we may have lost it with this? What are you talking about? Yes. Of course. Well, you think they may have got or may not have gotten it, or that you caught the guy and that everything's over, and that you're still not going to have an entire nation state who wants your technology. Oh, well, we missed it, guys. Let's just wrap up and go home. No, it just, and you get lots of things like this. I mean, the General Electric, acted in that facility. What the heck? Then they're surprised when things get stolen. So
Yeah.
there's a lot that corporate America really has to learn.
Well, and again, I think corporate America also has to take a really balanced approach to this because this is state level. And again, this is not the Chinese people, right? And
Right.
so,
Of course
yeah,
not. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. That's another interesting point. It's not just corporate America and the federal government. I mean, two big players. And we are not structured in the federal government to protect corporate America, one of our big problems. Federal government's great at protecting itself and its own secrets. Proves pretty lousy at protecting General Electric or someone else, right? They go out and give them a threat briefing. Okay, thanks for the help. They're not particularly good at that. But there's also the state levels, and states have taken their own role. Particularly Florida has moved out and making that type of theft of technology illegal at a state level, which I find fantastic. I mean, every state should take Florida's example and bring more attention towards it, bring more resources towards it, and take a leadership role in protecting the corporations and the companies, the people, the citizens that work in your state.
yeah, absolutely. Well, Nick, thank you again for your time. I genuinely can't thank you enough. Let's close by sharing where people can learn more about this issue and your work. Because I understand you have a new book coming out and you write on this topic in a number of publications. I will put links in the interview notes, but I'm wondering, where can people learn more about your work and how to protect themselves and your books and all of that?
Okay, so because I teach and work with federal government, they make you start an LLC to do that. So I do have an LLC. It's called Shinobi Enterprises. One word, Shinobi Enterprises. And Shinobi was the actual ancient word for the name ninja. The name ninja, the word ninja didn't come about to the 1950s. Was never known in Japan. So anyway, it's Shinobi Enterprises. And what I've done is I put on one page there in publications, I have for a library, I think, I've put all the articles I've written, the papers that I've written, interviews that I've given, and lectures that I've done. So as well as some graphics, which, as you point out, which illustrate a lot of the, China's espionage activity, who's behind them, and what type of tradecraft is used. So that's a great place to start for anyone who's really looking to spin up, to bone up on Chinese espionage. It's all free. Just go and immerse yourself, and hopefully you should learn a lot about the subject.
Wonderful. Well, Nick, thank you again so much.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.